Welcome to this video. I want to tell you the story of I saw the Beatles at Candlestick Park in San Francisco in 1966. Candlestick Park was the baseball park for the San Francisco area in those days. It's now been replaced by a different one. But the Beatles did play there. I used to have a friend that I played guitars with. I used to play guitar at home, and he was a good guitarist. And he went in the Navy for a year and a half, and he came back. And it was before he went in the Navy, he used to help me to transcribe records, like B.B. King records, learn the licks and the solos. And in those days, transcribing meant, we called it drop the needle. So you have to have the record going, and then you have to drop the needle in the right place for what you want to learn. It's very difficult. And before my friend went into the Navy, we'll call him Mike. And Mike would, I'd drop it down, and he'd sing it and play it, and then he would teach it to me. But he went into the Navy, and about a year and a half, I had a knock on my door on a Saturday or Sunday morning. I opened the door, and it was Mike. And so I had gotten better in a year and a half. I'd gotten a little better. I was playing my guitar every day. And we started just practicing together. And we would sit and play together. Blues music, I'd play rhythm, he'd play lead, he'd play rhythm, I'd play lead. And we got into this habit where we'd be there for hours, and I'd be playing and exploring and discovering things, and he would be doing the same thing. He'd be playing, exploring, discovering things, and we weren't playing together at all. And then at some point we would come and play together, and then we'd go back to our research, and every once in a while, he might say, "Hey, Antar, what are you playing there?" And I'd show him. Sometimes I'd say, "Hey, Mike, what's that?" And so I learned a lot doing that. So one time we were practicing at his house, at Mike's house, and he lived in the hills above the small town of Millbrae in Northern California, which is a suburb of San Francisco, and it's not too far from Candlestick Park. And I think everybody knew that the Beatles were playing there that day. I hadn't planned to go and see the Beatles. I didn't buy a ticket or anything, and I can imagine then what it must have been like to get a ticket to go see the Beatles at Candlestick Park, which, by the way, became the last public concert of the Beatles. They just dropped out of touring and concertizing to focus on studio work. So, except for that rooftop concert, if that was a concert, nobody really knows. Candlestick was the end, 1966, for that. So we were at Mike's house in the hills above Millbrae, and I walked in that day, and his father was an old guy, about 60 or something years old in those days. He was retired. He was a musician too, and he was playing on an old ancient harpsichord, right, with the keyboard, 2 keyboards or whatever, and this thing also had foot pedals, acoustic foot pedals. and he had his music. He was playing J.S. Bach. He was playing Baroque music. So, I very respectfully came in and said hello and slipped by him, and I went into the garage where Mike was, and Mike was sitting there with an old 1957 gold top Les Paul, kind of torn up a little bit, and I had an old 1954 Stratocaster, Fender Stratocaster. So, we had our rhythm and our energy, and so we just put our backs against the wall in the garage, so we're not going to disturb Papa with his Bach, right? We put our backs against the wall and we started practicing. So we were doing what we do, I'd play my thing and he'd play his thing, and we weren't playing together, and sometimes we'd fall together and play together. And Mike says, "Hey, you want to go see the Beatles? The Beatles are at Candlestick. You want to go see the Beatles?" And I said, "Well, I had planned to. I don't have any tickets." "Why? You got tickets?" He says, "No, we'll just go down there and let's just go down there and, hang around in the parking lot and listen to the girls scream." So, and now in those days, in 1966, it was still during the British invasion in the United States. Whenever a famous band would play, an English band, the Beatles, the Stones, the Animals, anybody, it was the custom for all the girls in the audience to scream their guts out continually. I heard a rumor that Eric Burdon and the Animals played at the Circle Star Theater in Redwood City, and they started doing the screaming, and Burdon stopped the band and he said to them, "Why don't you just listen to the music, stop screaming." Anyway, Mike said, "Let's go into the parking lot at Candlestick Park while the Beatles are playing and listen to the girls scream." I said, "All right." So we drove down there, parked the car, and we went into the parking lot, and we were just like moving around. It sounded like the music had already started. And to be sure, there was a lot of screaming going on. And then Mike said, "Look at this." And he found a stairway, an old creaky stairway that went up. Candlestick Park was like a big bowl. You had to go up the side of it on a staircase, and you enter on the top. So he found a stairway to the Beatles. So we went up the stairway. We're going up the stairway. The Beatles are playing, and the Beatles are playing, and we get to the top, and some guy approaches us. He looks like a ticket man. And I didn't know. I thought, oh shit, we're in trouble. We're going to get in trouble for crashing this place. The guy comes over to us and he sells us each a ticket, $6.50, to hear the Beatles on their last gig at Candlestick Park, and no waiting, So we went in and we took our seat. The Beatles were playing. Amazing. And you could see, with them set up in a baseball park, because of the screaming and because of other things, because of the fact that the sound systems in those days were not the big, magnificent sound systems that we have today. They hadn't been able to hear each other when they're, when you're playing, you need to hear each other. You need to hear yourself. You need to hear each other. Nowadays we have monitor speakers, or speakers that are like pointed toward the artist. But, that wasn't the fashion then, not till a little later. And they just hadn't been hearing themselves. And anyway, everybody is screaming. And they were getting burned out on the touring and the hotels and always being whisked around in different places. And so that's why that was their last gig. That's why they decided to just go into the studio from then on. They couldn't hear themselves. it's not fun to play anymore if you can't hear yourself, you can't hear the others. And so that was one of the complaints that they had about playing concerts and the screaming and everything. But this time in Candlestick Park, now I don't know what the Beatles were hearing, whether they could hear themselves or hear each other, I don't know. But I could hear it clear as a bell, you know. There were speakers everywhere. And this is a baseball park, right? There were speakers in the infield, monitors pointed at the Beatles. Speakers in the infield, speakers in the outfield, and it was really clear. And I could very easily hear the Beatles' harmonies were rough and out of tune, and they were kind of ragged, you know, singing and playing together. And it didn't sound very good, really, you know. It'd be nicer to hear a Beatles record, you know. And anyway, all those people went there just to scream. So, anyway, we heard the Beatles. I can't remember, so long ago, I can't remember what songs they played. I think you can look that up on the internet in the vaults, you know, that have set lists of what bands played and where and when and all that. But I can't remember. I sort of remembered Ticket to Ride, I don't know. And then the other act was the Ronettes. The Ronettes were a girl group that were managed by the rock entrepreneur Phil Spector. And he was actually married to the lead singer Ronnie Spector. And so it was the Ronettes. And if those of you who remember, they had a big hit called Be My Baby. And it was used by Martin Scorsese in one of his early films. It was used in that movie about gang life on the street. His name escapes me right now, with Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro. And it was, you know, Phil Spector was considering suing Scorsese for that, for using it without permission. Anyway, the Ronettes, they had many hits. They were good performers. But the Ronettes were a trio of women, and they were singers, you know. So it's not like a band like the Beatles. It's important to remember that, you know, sure, there were bands all over the world. But before the Beatles, in mass media culture, the artists were usually billed as a single artist, you know. Frankie Avalon, Elvis, Fabian, you know, Annette Funicello. But yeah, they perform with bands, but they sometimes perform with different bands when they'd go on tour, you know, they'd get a local band. So the Ronettes had their band with them. It was a magnificent band. That was a band that was put together by Phil Spector. And I found out recently that actually the Ronettes were on the tour with the Beatles. So they had toured all the other dates before Candlestick. And Spector knew a lot of musicians, and he gave a lot of musicians their start. Sonny and Cher, and the Righteous Brothers. And he didn't give the Righteous Brothers their start, but he produced You've Lost That Loving Feeling, and he also composed it a little bit. He put the Latin part in that song. So he got the best musicians. Some of them were probably musicians from Hollywood, from Columbia Records, called the Wrecking Crew, which there's been a lot of buzz about the Wrecking Crew in recent years. And I think the lead guitarist was James Burton, who was a guy that played with Ricky Nelson, and he played with Elvis. So the Ronettes actually sounded really good to me. I really enjoyed the Ronettes. So that was an interesting piece of history 1966 was kind of a turning point. And I saw the Stones that year also at San Jose Civic. And that was also just screaming madness, screaming, you know. It was disappointing for me. I was a big Stones fan. And I couldn't hear them. And none of the Rolling Stones on the stage were really much interested in performing. They just were playing. And while Mick Jagger was gyrating and jumping around, you know. And the girls were screaming, you know. So maybe I should call this video The Scream. Anyway, I hope you enjoy that story. It's an interesting story. How we got in there. And probably sad and ironic for some of the Beatles fans. I wasn't a big Beatles fan, you know. I hadn't planned on going. I just heard about it, you know. We actually got to go in there and see the show. So it was great. So now we're coming to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Ciao.